Okay, we are about to get started. So I can say, Eric, Nathan from the committee room will bring over some documents, as I understand, that we should have printed in the committee room, okay? And then once we go live, I'll just say that for the record. So, Jewel, you let me know when we're live. I know. Thank you. I know you're multitasking. All right, so we are live. Well, for the record, anyone listening, we have printed copies in the committee room, and staff is bringing some physical copies over. After we report this information out, it will be available online as well. With that, we are here for our decisions meeting for the budget that we will report out to the full committee. We're going to start with the DLS, I think, language report out. So, Elizabeth, you can begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll begin on page 12 with the subsequent injury fund. DLS recommended concurring with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted the recommendation.
Is there a motion? All right, so moved. Let's keep going.
On the following page, the uninsured employers fund, DLS had recommended restricting $150,000 of UEF's administrative budget until the agency addressed repeat audit findings. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
All right, thank you.
All right, on the following page, 14, the Senate also adopted narrative directing UEF and the Workers' Compensation Commission to form a work group to study and make recommendations regarding UEF's long-term financial solvency.
Let's keep going. Thank you.
And then on the following page, the Workers' Compensation Commission, DLS recommended concurring with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Okay, on page 17, the Board of Public Works, DLS recommended for the Maryland Zoo to submit an annual audited financial report and quarterly report showing monthly attendance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On page 20, Secretary of State, the DLS requested for the Secretary to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate rejected. And the Senate has requested for the Secretary of State on page 21 to submit a report on the status of vacant positions.
Thank you. Let's keep going, Micah.
On page 43, the State Treasurer, DLS recommended for the State Treasurer to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and Senate adopted.
Is there a motion? All right, thank you.
For the Executive Department, Office of the Governor, on page 18, the DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On page 19, the Executive Department, Boards, Commissions, and Offices, DLS recommended a narrative for a report on participation in the Minority Business Enterprise Program. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On page 30, Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, DLS recommended reduction in general funds as a technical correction. Agency concurred, Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On the following page, State Board of Elections, DLS recommended a narrative requesting quarterly reports on all major IT projects. The agency concurred, Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On the next page, 32, DLS recommended narrative requesting report on TRICARE Premium Reimbursement Program implementation and participation. Agency concurred, Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On the following page, 33, this is an additional First House action. DLS recommended narrative requesting report on the Free State Challenge Academy staffing status and long-term staffing plan. Senate adopted.
Let's keep going. Thank you.
On page 36, Department of Veterans Affairs, DLS recommended narrative requesting quarterly reports on Charlotte Hall Veterans Home facility operations, staffing, and federal ratings. Agency concurred, Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Starting on page 34 with the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, the first action is committee narrative requesting a report on activity related to the Resilient Maryland Revolving Loan Fund. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On the next page, page 35, also Maryland Department of Emergency Management, second action is committee narrative requesting a report on activity related to the state and local cybersecurity grant program. And the agency concurred and Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Moving to page 39, Comptroller. The first action is committee narrative requesting submission of both tax year and fiscal year data in next year's Managing for Results submission. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
The second action is a technical correction for double budgeted employee health insurance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On the following page, page 40, also with Comptroller, committee narrative requesting a 5-year plan for adding staff and technology resources and estimated additional revenue resulting from these additions. The Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Moving to page 42, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Cannabis Commission. The first action is committee narrative requesting the addition of Managing for Results measures for cannabis sales violations in next year's Managing for Results submission. The agency concurred in part, noting that because of legal action preventing full enforcement activities, this data may not be complete in next year's submission. And the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Moving to page 44 for the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. The first action restricts funds pending a report on the status of staffing in the Real Property Valuation Program. The agency concurred in part, requesting the removal of the requirement that the agency research and report on average and median salaries for comparable positions in surrounding states. The Senate adopted.
Thank you.
On the next page, page 45, the second action for SSTAT restricts funding pending report on cybersecurity needs at SSTAT and on the status of the Cloud Revenue Integrated System Development Project. The agency concurred and Senate adopted.
Thank you.
A third action for SSTAT on page 47 restricts $500,000 for administration pending a report due July 1st, 2024 on the recent property assessment notice mailing error. The Senate adopted.
All right, thank you.
Reading the
Take
additional
us to the additional action.
the additional action.
Yep.
Also on the mailing error, but including a number of more detailed questions, including on plans for handling any legal consequences of the error.
Okay. And that was page 1 of the special.
Page 1 of the additional packet, yes. Sorry.
Thank you.
Looking at page 49 for Property Tax Assessment Appeals Board. We recommend concurring with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Moving to Department of General Services on page 50. The first action is standard language restricting funds pending the correction of repeat audit violations and a report from the Office of Legislative Audits confirming the correction of each finding. The agency concurred and Senate adopted.
Thank you.
The second action on page 51 is committee narrative requesting report on the status of state center agency relocations and use of dedicated purpose account funds for this purpose. The agency concurred and Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Actions pertaining to the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention and Policy begin on page 22 of the white packet. The first three actions recommended by DLS pertain to the Victims of Crime Act program. The first house rejected the two reports in a letter in favor of a single report, which is shown on page 27 as the first additional first house action.
Yep.
Okay. Then on page 26, action 4 would increase the turnover expectancy for new positions for the agency. GOCAP concurred, and the first house adopted. Item 5 is a general fund reduction that was recommended by DLS for the state aid for police protection enhancement funding. The agency disagreed, and the first house adopted. Item 6 is a DLS recommendation that funds be withheld pending the submission of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board annual report. The agency concurred in part and is happy to submit the report, but requests that funds not be withheld. The Senate adopted the recommendation. We'll now jump to page 28 for where committee narrative that was adopted by the Senate appears. This committee narrative asks for a report on invoice and payment methodology to be due October 1st.
Thank you.
The third action taken by the Senate was budget language. It appears as item number 3. It requires that the mayor's office submit information to GOCAP so that money through the Baltimore City Safe Streets grant can be released. Action number 4 requires that $5 million of the state aid for police protection enhancement funding not be released until law enforcement agencies attest to GOCAP that employees have completed training on juvenile interrogation requirements.
Thank you.
That concludes the GOCAP portion. So now we're going to jump to page 75 for the Department of Juvenile Services. The first DLS recommendation was to restrict $50,000 pending a report on out-of-home placement wait times. The agency concurred, but concurred in part and requested that funds not be withheld. The Senate modified that recommendation to change the due date to January 15th, and that modification appears on page 76. Action number 2 restricts $100,000 pending the submission of the next facilities master plan. The department concurs in part and plans to submit the plan by the end of calendar 2024, but asks that funds not be withheld. The Senate adopted. Additional first house actions appear on page 78. There's just one. The Senate adopted committee narrative for report on services for youth in alternatives to detention due July 1st. There are 2 additional items for DJS on pages 6 through 8 of the green packet. The action that appears on page 6 is committee narrative, which would require DJS to report on community feedback it receives for the Maryland Youth Residence Center project in Baltimore City.
Thank you.
Then the action that appears on page 7 and 8 requests narrative, or is a narrative request for a report on the Thrive Academy due November 1st, 2024, after the first year of data would be available.
Thank you.
We'll now jump back to the white packet with the Department of State Police, which begins on page 79. The first action was a recommendation to delete funds for the supplemental retirement account match, which is currently budgeted within the Department of Budget and Management. The agency disagreed and the first house adopted. Action 2 and action 2 on page 79 and action 4 on page 80 are related. They are to increase the turnover expectancy for new positions in the department to 25%, which is the standard amount consistent for new positions. The agency disagreed, and the Senate rejected both.
Yep. Thank you.
DLS also recommended that narrative be required for narrative to be submitted quarterly for report on permitting applications received by the licensing department. This appears on the bottom of page 79 and the top of page 80. The agency concurred and the first house adopted. Action number 5 is a recommendation to add a section to the budget bill, which would enable or require that funds be withheld for the annual uniform crime report data. The agency concurred and the first house adopted. Then there's one additional first house action for the department, which appears on page 82, the absolute last page of the document. This is narrative for a report on forensic laboratory capacity and expenditure due July 1st.
For the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, items start in the white decision document packet on page 52. DLS recommended adding budget bill language restricting funds pending a report on the Public Information Act and a plan to comply with it. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
The second item on page 53 is an annual request for Justice Reinvestment Act data. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted. On page 54, item number 3 is annual report on recidivism. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted. Item number 4 is a new recommendation for narrative for enhanced correctional program participation measures. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted. Item number 5 on page 55. This is also a new recommendation for committee narrative. DLS recommended requiring notification 14 days prior to presenting a medical a medical/mental health care contract for either the correctional or pretrial parts of the department before the Board of Public Works. The agency disagreed because of the timing of it, and the Senate on page 56 modified that to reduce the time to only 7 days prior, which would fit with the Board of Public Works schedule.
Thank you.
On page 57, there is an additional action that the Senate took restricting funds pending a report on apprenticeships. There is also a color page related to this item, page 3 of the green packet, which modifies this language to require engaging with the bargaining units. Yes, for the employee unions. Okay.
Yep, keep going. Thank you, Jim.
Moving to corrections on page 59 of the decision document packet, the DLS recommendation was to restrict funds pending the quarterly hiring and attrition reports. Agency concurred and the Senate adopted. There is an additional action the Senate took on page 60, which restricts funds pending a plan to eliminate the use of mandatory overtime. The Senate, this was an additional Senate action.
Thank you.
There is also, on page 61, an additional action the Senate took requesting information on racial discrimination and retaliation related to an ongoing lawsuit in Western Maryland.
Thank you.
On page 63, there's an additional action the Senate took requesting narrative request for information on the reentry passport program, extending the request from last year and asking for more information.
Thank you.
On page 65, the Senate took an additional action. So this is a narrative request for more information, again, extending the request from last year on the treatment of transgender individuals.
Thank you.
Then there is an additional House item to consider on page 4 of the additional item packet. This is narrative that would request more information on the programming aspect of the Women's Pre-Release Gender Responsive Pre-Release Act.
Thank you.
Moving on to, back to the decision packet on page 68, community supervision. The first DLS recommendation was to request the annual caseload report. The Senate modified that on page 68 and 69 to request more information, particularly related to agent caseload sizes, distributions, and those that have too high a caseload. For the, the next page, page 70, there is the second DLS recommendation asking for a report on assessment tools. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted. On page 72, in the Police and Correctional Training Commissions, well, on 71, DLS recommendation was to concur. On 72, the Senate instead took an action adding language restricting funds for deadlines for the strategic plan for spending the MPTSC fund. Yep. And finally, on page 74 for me, with the Division of Pretrial Detention and Services, the DLS recommendations to concur, agency concurred, and the Senate adopted.
Thank you, Jacob. Are we waiting for his mic? No worries.
All righty. Back to page 1, please. For the judiciary, the first recommendation was to reduce $5.6 million in general funds for the purpose of operating expenses, with the Chief Justice authorized to allocate the reduction across programs within the judiciary. Agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
The second recommendation was to reduce $8.8 million in general funds made for the purpose of employee merit increases due to their being double budgeted. The First House modified this action to reduce $7,910,680 in general funds, with the Chief Justice authorized to allocate the reduction across the judiciary. The agency disagreed. The Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Item number 3 for the judiciary may be found on page 2 of the decision document. The third item adds language providing that $500,000 in general funds for the purpose of providing attorneys for required representation is reduced. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Number 4 restricts $8.75 million of the appropriation made for the purpose of providing attorneys for the appointed attorney program for that purpose. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
The fifth recommendation is to adopt narrative regarding the appointed attorney program costs and utilizations, requesting a report from the judiciary on those. The judiciary concurred, and the Senate adopted. Moving to page 3. Item number 6 is a recommendation for narrative requesting a report on the annual court performance measures. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Number 7 is a recommendation for narrative regarding the problem-solving court's performance and funding. The agency concurred in part. They were happy to report on the performance aspect, but had concerns regarding the funding aspect. The Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Moving to page 4, we have item number 8 is narrative regarding a report on major information technology development project status. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Item number 9 is narrative regarding a report on the balance of the Land Records Improvement Fund. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Item number 10 is narrative regarding a report on the need for judgeships in fiscal 2026. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Items 11 and 12 relate. Item number 11 is technical for the implementation of item number 12. The two items together reduce $500,000 in general funds for the fiscal 2024 appropriation for the judiciary made for the purpose of providing appointed attorneys in accordance with DeWolf v. Richmond. And I want to clarify that's on items 11 and 12, correct?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving to page 6 for the Office of the Public Defender. Item number 1, it was a recommendation that the appropriation be reduced by $1.7 million in general funds, $386 in special funds, and $9,852 in federal funds to align with increased turnover expectancy among existing positions at the agency. The agency disagreed. The Senate rejected.
Thank you.
The second item was language providing that the appropriation be reduced by $816,719 in general funds to align with increased turnover expectancy among new positions at the agency, with the Office of the Public Defender authorized to allocate the reduction. The agency disagreed. The Senate rejected. The third item is narrative regarding the regarding a report on hiring, separation, and caseloads. The agency concurred, the agency agreed, and the Senate adopted. Pardon me. On page 7, you'll find an additional item from the First House regarding the Office of the Public Defender. This action provides that $2,521,233 in general funds, $386 in special funds, and $9,852 in federal funds of the appropriation made for the purpose of salaries and wages may not be expended for that purpose, but instead may be used only to increase salaries for existing positions. The Senate adopted this action.
Thank you.
Moving to page 8, we have the Office of the Attorney General. The first item was language provided that the appropriation be reduced by $984,763 in general funds, $223 in special funds, and $5,692 in federal funds to align with increased turnover expectancy among existing positions at the agency. The agency disagreed and the Senate rejected. Item number 2 involves narrative requesting quarterly reports on the Access to Counsel and Evictions program. The agency concurred. The Senate made modifications which appear on page 9, namely adding in a couple of extra items for the report. So the Senate has adopted that action.
Thank you.
Moving to page 10, we have the Office of the State Prosecutor. Recommendation is to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred. The Senate adopted. Page 11 is the Maryland Tax Court. Recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. Agency concurred. Senate adopted.
Thank you.
We will next jump, please, to page 37 for the State Archives. And we will go, yes, page 37. Recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. Agency concurred, and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Next is page 38, for the Office of Administrative Hearings, please. Recommendation is to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred. The Senate adopted. Okay.
Yeah.
That is that for me. We should just do a quick check.
Yeah. We've gone through everything, right?
That's a check.
Okay. So while he's doing that, I just want to say, colleagues, so we've done the bulk of our work for this budget season for the House, and I'm pretty proud of the work product that we produced. I want to thank, and we'll say this again in full committee, but I want to thank all the DLS analysts for all their hard work in reviewing the budgets and the reports. I want to thank you guys for slogging through and reading all of that while trying to push your own bills. I think we've gotten a lot through reviewing health contracts for corrections, programming to make sure women got what they deserved in the pre-release program, to the transgender stuff, to caseload management, OPD salaries, giving some flexibility to our Attorney General's office on money that's already allotted to them. Working with our judiciary to make sure that the funds for monitoring people who's on pretrial and whatnot is available. Giving resources to our state elections team on technology. A lot of things we've done with our comptroller's office on technology and innovation so that they can essentially track down money that's already owed to the state and therefore we don't have to talk about revenues, right? MIMSOLVs, our emergency management fund, we're trying to make sure we make them solvent. I really want to tip my hat off to one of our newest members, and Delegate Spiegel, and chairing when we had Department of Veteran Affairs. We got a little bit of press attention when that was going on, but I thought he did a great job. And this is my first time chairing this body, and I've really appreciated the professionalism and candor you guys have had. So for all that, thank you guys so much. Okay. Also for the record, so the BRFA will be voted on in full committee tomorrow. At the same time, we take up the full budget. So there's some items that come out of PSA that will be relevant in there, but we're not going to do that here. We're going to do that in full committee tomorrow for the BRFA. Okay. I think it will be the same, if I understand. All right. So I think with that we're done on operating side. Capital, we're gonna that's next week's issue. Yeah, I would move to adopt the committee report. Any seconds? All right. Everyone in favor? There we go. We are adjourned. Thank you, guys.